I'm Kurt Munz, and this is joint work with Vicki Morwitz. In this presentation, we're going to look at how a marketer's presentation of information affects information processing, specifically comparing text in its written form to text spoken aloud. We'll be studying this in the context of voice commerce. So voice commerce is a rapidly developing area. You can see the photo of smart speakers. Sales of these smart speakers have really grown, as you can see in the graph on the left, to the point where 34% of Americans use a voice assistant at least monthly. And these voice assistants are showing up in places other than smart speakers as well. There are voice assistants on smartphones, as you see in the picture. They're increasingly being found also in other places, like in the car or entertainment devices like on the television. One of the things that these smart assistants can be used for is shopping. So already in 2020 in the US, there was $2.7 billion in transactions conducted via voice using these smart assistants. And the number of smart speaker buyers also continues to grow. So while these numbers look very favorable, there's also reason to be concerned about the growth. So a recent report cited information statistics within Amazon that suggested 98% of Amazon Echo owners had not used the device to make a purchase, and of those who had, 9 out of 10 had only made a single purchase. That is, they didn't make any repeat purchases. So this suggests that there might be something holding consumers back from fully embracing voice shopping. In this presentation, we'll suggest that auditory processing difficulty is one element that may be keeping consumers from fully embracing voice commerce. Before I talk about why that might be the case, it's also true that it might not be the case. So we know from research on child development, for example, that of the primacy of voice. Children can learn language without being formally taught language in the spoken and auditory form. However, the same cannot be true for written forms of writing. Also, societies have developed spoken languages much earlier in their development and across 100% of societies, whereas written forms of language exist in a relative minority. You can also put this in more pragmatic terms. If you've ever not wanted to watch a video with subtitles, you can appreciate that it's comparatively easier to process auditory information. There's also some work to suggest that they may be comparable. So there's studies of reading comprehension have compared written books with audiobooks and found that reading comprehension between the two media are fairly similar, with some boundary conditions for like very heavy scientific type journals or something like that. On the other side, on the flip side, voice interface designers, so people that have designed like telephone systems, have long advocated to minimize the cognitive challenges for consumers, suggesting that these voice interface designers are aware that there are cognitive challenges for users. So we're going to suggest that in certain conditions, auditory information can be more difficult to process. We're going to suggest that it's specifically related to difficulty making comparisons. And why would that be the case? To begin, in an auditory format, in order to make comparisons, one necessarily must hold information in memory while processing new information that's being presented by voice. Work on cognitive load suggests that this can interfere with one's ability to process the information. This is related to the sequential presentation of options, which independently has been shown to make comparison harder. Also, voice may interfere with uses of choice strategies. So an example might be the lexicographic choice strategy. So rather than using all of the information, using just a portion of that, voice could actually make it harder to use all of the information that's available, or it could make it more likely. So if it's harder to process, you can imagine that people could rely more heavily on a lexicographic strategy. We have three specific predictions. The first concerns recommendations. So there's some existing research that shows that task difficulty increases the likelihood of taking advice. So we predict that when making comparisons, auditory consumers will be more likely to choose recommended products. The second prediction is about choice deferral. There is existing research that suggests that as choice difficulty increases, the likelihood of deferring choice increases. So we predict that when making comparisons, auditory consumers will be more likely to defer choice. And finally, the last prediction concerns attitudes. There's some existing work that suggests that cognitive load interferes with attitude formation. So we predict that when making comparisons, auditory consumers will be less effective in distinguishing between the options, which will mean that the attitudes toward products represented in an auditory format will be less differentiated. They'll be closer together. So if we were to draw a theoretical framework, it would look something like this. Presentation mode on the left leads to processing difficulty, specifically when consumers need to make comparisons because it places demands on memory. And this has effects for choosing recommended options, deferring choice, and attitudes. So we've developed a package of studies to provide evidence for this framework. It includes 16 experiments. For the sake of time, we'll show you 4 here. The first experiment I'll show you shows the main effects, that this affects the DVs we predict, and will show mediation by processing difficulty. The second set of experiments will look to show that this is specifically related to making comparisons, considering joint versus separate evaluation and the case of a single item when you're comparing it to a standard of reference held in memory. And then finally, we'll explore the role of memory. So we'll look at working memory as a moderating factor. So the first experiment is designed to show the main effects. This is a 2-group design between subjects where we manipulated whether the information was presented in a verbal form using the voice of Amazon Alexa reading the text, or if the text was presented on a computer screen. All the participants were told that they would imagine they are shopping with the help of a digital assistant, and they will either hear or see a recommendation from the digital assistant, where there will be 2 product options and one of them will be recommended. So this is an example of the stimuli consistent with the stimuli that we've used across all the studies. There's an option A, a brand A on the left, that's recommended. But as you can see by comparing the actual features of this brand, it has 143 sheets compared to 158 sheets and 4.6 stars compared to 4.7. Even though brand A is recommended, the attributes that are presented here, it's objectively inferior to brand B. So our prediction is that in a visual context, consumers would use this information about the attributes more in their decision making and choose brand B more often, whereas in an auditory context, consumers would be more likely to choose brand A. In the auditory condition, they saw a button on the screen that looked like this, where they could hit play, and the same information that was displayed on the previous screen was instead read aloud to them by Amazon Alexa. They could click this play button as many times as they wished. Consistent with our predictions, auditory consumers were more likely to choose a recommended option, doing so 26% of the time compared to 13% of the time. At the same time, they were also more likely to defer choice, so they chose neither option more often than did visual consumers. We tested the mediating role of processing difficulty using an existing scale. Consistent with our intuitions, auditory consumers rated this task to be more complex, complicated, and difficult to understand to a greater extent than did visual consumers, and these differences mediated the effects we saw on choice. We also had a prediction related to attitudes. We predicted that auditory consumers would be less effective in distinguishing between the options. Consistent with this prediction, we find a significant interaction such that auditory consumers exhibited a smaller difference between the 2 options than did visual consumers. So what you're looking at here is a mixed design ANOVA where on the x-axis represents the between subjects, auditory versus visual conditions, and each consumer rated both option A and option B in terms of their favorability on a 9-point scale. So you're probably thinking at this point that these effects that we've seen, despite the mediation, could be related to lots of different factors. So in a series of experiments, we tested lots of different factors to see if they were related. For example, we ran with human voice. We ran a counterbalanced version of this. We ran a version where the recommendation was made after describing the options versus before, to see if consumers are simply just, or if auditory consumers are simply not paying attention once a recommendation is made. We used stimuli that didn't involve numbers, but instead used things like outstanding versus good, and we still are able to find the effects in all these conditions. We also tried to equate for time. So in the time equivalent study, the text was presented on the screen slowly in the visual condition to equate for the speaking rate in the audio condition. We did a condition where the options in the visual condition were presented sequentially to control for that. And in the disappearing text condition, the text both appeared slowly at the rate of speech and then disappeared several seconds later to account for the ephemeral nature of speech. We still find the effects in that case, although smaller in effect size. So the next set of studies will look at process, specifically providing evidence that this is related to making comparisons. The first way we tried to do this was in a joint versus separate context. So there's existing literature that suggests that consumers can learn about the choice options by comparing them to other options that are in the choice set. So if a consumer were considering only the option on the left, they understand what the year means, they understand what like new means, and probably put a lot of weight on that idea, but they might not have a good idea of how many entries normally go into a musical dictionary. Whereas if it presented in the context of a second option, and they can see that it has half as many as this other option, now they can evaluate that attribute is not so great. So Chris Shih and colleagues presented predicted choice reversals and demonstrated choice reversals in this context when option A, the one on the left there, was evaluated independently. Consumers understood that like new was good, and so they rated that option favorably, whereas when in comparison, option B was rated more favorably. We predict that these preference reversals rely on being able to easily compare. So our prediction is that we'll get this Chris Shih style joint versus separate preference reversal in the visual condition, but we won't find it in the auditory condition. We developed new stimuli to test this idea. So the idea here is that Amazon's number 1 or number 9 choice is easy to evaluate outside of context, whereas 10 cup capacity and star rating are ideas that are more easily interpreted in the context of other options. So we predict that in a single evaluation case, water filter A will be picked, and a joint evaluation case, water filter B will be preferred. So following the previous research, there were 3 between subject conditions, which we then crossed with sensory mode for a 6-group design in total. This again used the voice of Amazon Alexa. The 3 conditions were that they evaluate either option A, option B, or both option A and option B. In the visual condition, we replicated Chris Shih's prior work, showing that there was a preference reversal between joint and separate evaluation. Consistent with the visual case, auditory consumers also favored option A over option B when they were separate evaluation, but they also did so in joint evaluation. In other words, they didn't show a preference reversal that we saw in the visual case, consistent with our hypotheses. This was specifically because consumers rated the joint evaluation case more difficult, specifically in the auditory condition. So instead of using that scale that we used before, we used ease on a 9-point scale, and they found it less easy to make these comparisons, not as easy to understand the information is what we used. So while we have discussed this in the terms of comparisons, we also argue that comparisons are more common than you may guess. So even in the case of reordering, consumers need to compare, is the option that's being presented to me, is this my usual brand? Is this the usual package size? Is this my usual flavor? Does it cost more or less than usual? bringing this idea of comparisons to the lab, we brought this idea in the idea of comparing to a standard of reference. So in this experiment, which is a 2x2 between subjects design, participants were asked to evaluate a multivitamin having either learned about a doctor-recommended minimum effective dose prior to evaluation or not. And then again, that's crossed with voice versus visual, this time the voice being a male Google Assistant voice. Consistent with our predictions, when consumers did not need to make predictions, the differences between auditory and visual conditions were about the same. There were no differences. However, when consumers needed to make a comparison, the auditory consumers were less effective in making this comparison, and their attitudes were less extreme compared to the visual case, representing a significant interaction. In the package, we also had studies where we manipulated the ease of comparison to show that this is the process, but I don't have time to discuss them here. In a final experiment, I want to show that this is specifically related to memory. So in a pre-registered design, we looked at we did both a memory task, which is supposed to look for individual differences in working memory, and then we see how that affects consumer choices. So what we find is that as only in the auditory condition, as auditory consumers' working memory increases, their choices look more and more like visual consumers. However, there's no effective working memory in the visual case, presumably because consumers don't need to use their working memory in the visual case. So across the studies I've shown you today, we've shown that auditory information can be more difficult to process, which is related to difficulty making comparisons. It has consequences for accepting recommendations, choice deferral, and attitudes, and is robust across many different operationalizations. In future work, we intend to focus more on this condition of the reordering and take that as our direction moving forward. Thanks very much for your time.